Hi, I'm Geerges. His father was a decorated Israeli war hero who fought for the creation of Israel and its expansion in 1967. Now Miko Peled is a peace activist fighting for the rights of Palestinians. Do you not feel like you have the moral authority to say Palestinians have got to stop terrorism?
I don't think that what Palestinians are doing is terrorism. I think the Palestinian resistance is a legitimate resistance.
Welcome to the Geerges Show. Israeli Miko Peled was at his home in San Diego when he'd heard that there was a suicide attack in Jerusalem. Then he got the call. His 13-year-old niece was shopping for school books when an explosion took her life. That was 1997. At that point, he decided to reach out to Palestinians to understand their perspective and pain and to advocate for a fair and peaceful solution to the conflict. He's written a memoir called The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Miko, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Will you tell us about your niece?
Well, like you described, she was 13 years old. She was a sweet kid, and it was the late 90s, mid to late 90s were a very violent time, very difficult time. There's a lot of violence, going on, and she was a victim of some of that violence. So it's a kind of horrifying experience that is hard to really fully express, I think.
There were 3 girls that were killed that day. Do you know anything about the suicide bombers?
Not much. I have seen their names. I know who they were, and there were 3 of them. Didn't really get much into who they were personally and so on and so forth. I know that they were Palestinians and they volunteered for this mission.
My niece is a teacher in Jerusalem, and I feel like if anything happened to her, I would be nowhere near as generous and forgiving as you have been with the Palestinians that did this.
Well, I don't know that I've been forgiving or generous. I think that, to be honest, if we take a look at the cause of the violence and we take into account that the vast majority of the victims have been Palestinians, then I don't think I've been forgiving at all, because I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, who was prime minister then and is prime minister now, and the people who voted for him and the government that serves under him and the Israeli military who serve under him are directly responsible for all of these deaths. The death of my niece and the death of the countless Palestinians who've been victims of this violence.
You don't hold the Palestinians responsible?
No. I think that as painful and as difficult as this is, the Palestinian struggle, by and large, is a struggle for freedom. It's a struggle for independence. It's a struggle that is...
Can't they do it without blowing up children?
Well, I don't know. They can do it in all kinds of different ways, and they have done it in many different ways. Palestinian resistance over 7 decades since Palestine was occupied in 1948 has been, varied. There's been a lot of unarmed violence, which doesn't really get a lot of attention. There has been a great deal of armed violence, although in comparison it's been far less than the nonviolent resistance. But that's what gets the attention. And people resist in all kinds of different ways. If we look at what is happening in Palestine overall, the question that begs to be asked is, can't Israel do what it does without resorting to violence? When Israel attacks Gaza and kills thousands in a matter of weeks, people call it self-defense, which is very odd, because there is no military threat to Israel from Gaza. There never has been. When Palestinians resort to violence in a struggle that is justified, that has been recognized internationally as legitimate, then people complain that they resort to violence. So, it is not an easy situation, but people resort to whatever it is they resort to when they are fighting for their independence and for their freedom.
We'll continue talking about that, but I want to talk about your father first, because he, very decorated military career in Israel. He fought for Israel's independence in 47 and 48. He was a general in the 1967 war, which is also called the Six-Day War. How big of a deal was he in Israel?
Well, he was one of the generation, what's called the 1948 generation, and they were like the gods of the Olympus. They were young officers, and they say they delivered the Jewish state on a silver platter to the Jewish people, so to speak, And then that generation, those of that group that remained in the military, 20 years later, were generals. They were the ones who orchestrated and executed the 1967, the Six-Day War, which of course was a spectacular victory again. So they
All
were,
those wars were spectacular victories for Israel.
yeah, for Israel, these are spectacular victories. And so they were like gods on the Olympus. What he did that kind of separated him from that and kind of hurt his reputation in many ways is that at the end of the 1967 war, he stood up while still in uniform and said, we now have the possibility to actually resolve the Palestinian question, because even though we all recognize, the land of Israel belongs to us because we're the Jews and so forth, there's another nation that lives here, and we need to find a way to live in peace with this other nation. Therefore, a Palestinian state alongside Israel would be the right thing to do. Mind you, he said this in 1967. And then throughout
Now, just to go back a little bit, because in the Six-Day War, Israel had taken the West Bank,
Yes.
it had taken Gaza,
Yes.
it had taken Sinai.
They'd taken the
actually,
Sinai
from
Peninsula
Egypt.
and the Golan Heights, yes, all within 6 days. So then he stood up and he said, well, now we have an opportunity to make peace. We have all these territories. We need to, embark on a process that will allow us to live here in this neighborhood that we chose, which is right in the center of the Arab world.
Now, why was that an unpopular position?
Because Israel didn't take the West Bank to give it back. Israel took the West Bank in order because it was part of the land of Israel, and they wanted to populate it with Jews, just like all the other parts of the land of Israel.
And what do you do with all the Palestinians that are already there?
Well, the problem, that's what they've done. What we do is what they've done. A report just came out saying that the state of Israel is an apartheid regime. Well, that's exactly what Israel did. Israel took the different groups of the different populations of Palestinians that it controls and governs them by different sets of laws, which is really what apartheid is. So you had the Palestinians, what's called of 1948, who are Israeli citizens. And until 1966, they were living under a military rule. Since 1966, they live as citizens, but with almost 100 laws that discriminate against them. Then you've got the Palestinians in the West Bank that live under a military law, military governor that controls their life, and the same with the Gaza Strip. And then you've got the Palestinians in Jerusalem who live under a different set of laws. And they're all different from the laws that I live in when I'm in Israel as an Israeli Jew. So that's what Israel does with these Palestinians. I mean, when you're going to have a Jewish state in an Arab country, the only way you can do that is by having an apartheid regime.
But your father was probably the only general that had those kinds of feelings.
He wasn't the only one, but he was the only one that expressed them as fiercely and was dedicated to this idea. He probably more than all the others, to a point where he was ostracized, and he was called a traitor by some people and so forth, because he took it to the limit. He believed that the only way that the state of Israel can survive is by making peace with the Palestinians and recognizing the Palestinians' right to self-determination, again, within a very small part of Palestine, which is the West Bank and Gaza. I think where he went wrong was that he thought that Israel could be restrained, that Zionism could be restrained.
Because he was a committed Zionist.
Completely, to his dying day.
He really believed that the
Completely.
Jews had every right to be in
Absolutely, yeah. Yes.
on that land.
Yes, he did.
Your father retired. He became a professor of Arab literature, and he was often called on to give lectures. And when the PLO came up, he said this, quote, "Terrorism is a terrible thing, but the fact remains that when a small nation is ruled by a larger power, terror is the only means at their disposal. If we want to end terrorism, we must end the occupation and make peace." Did your father really believe that terrorism was their only option?
Well, that's what he said. And I know that when he was a young man, when he was 16, 17 years old, and he volunteered and joined the Haganah and the Palmach, he later on said, I was a terrorist too. These were terrorist organizations. At least the British considered them to be terrorist organizations.
Intentionally targeting civilians?
Well, no, intentionally targeting whatever they thought was the occupation. So different parts within the Jewish militia, within the Jewish resistance target different parts. There were those that targeted civilians. There were others that only targeted military targets, others like bridges and so forth. So I mean, there was a whole range of opinions on that. But he felt, and I think he was wrong. I think that the Palestinians, not only the Palestinians, lately the Palestinians have certainly shown us that there are other methods that are even more effective than armed resistance. But we saw that with experience of blacks in the United States, with South Africa, with India, that there are methods, unarmed methods of resistance, most notably
Exactly, Miko.
Exist.
Isn't there historical proof that nonviolent resistance, yields results.
Oh, absolutely.
So why resort to terrorism? And why forgive it in a way of saying, well, you know, what are they going to do? That's their only option. They have to blow up civilians.
Well, that may have been his opinion as a military man.
Is it yours?
No, I think that obviously it has to do with the time and the place and the history and the conditions. I think that if we look at Vietnam and Algeria, then certainly the armed resistance was effective. If we look at Palestine, the armed resistance was not effective. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is very effective. And the work that Palestinians have been doing on the ground with a nonviolent resistance, with the popular committees in the villages and the towns that protest on a weekly basis, have been much more effective than the armed resistance. But I'm not going to sit here and preach to Palestinians and say, well, you should resist this way or that way, where I come from a family that has dedicated a great deal of time and effort into dispossessing and killing and created the conditions in which they live.
Do you not feel like you have the moral authority to say Palestinians have got to stop terrorism?
Well, I don't think that what Palestinians are doing is terrorism. I think the Palestinian resistance is a legitimate resistance. The methods that they use...
When they go into a pizza shop and blow themselves up and take with them children and women, and obviously everybody's a civilian in there.
Well, the Palestinians presented Israel with a possibility of ending the targeting of civilians a long time ago. Now, mind you, none of this has happened in a very long time. There have been no attacks on civilians by Palestinians. There have been no suicide bombings in many years.
Although there are rocket launches into Israel.
Rocket launches have been completely benign. Now, on the other hand...
But what about the stabbing?
On the other hand...
And the ramming?
On the other hand...
Okay.
When Israel bombs Gaza for 51 days and murders 2,500 innocent civilians, we are not in a position to tell Palestinians an individual who may or may not be angry, or who may have seen all of these other things happen over the last 7 decades and nothing works, to take a life of an Israeli. I personally don't believe in violence. I personally do not condone violence. I personally would not engage in violence. But that's me. I did not live that life. I've not seen my family destroyed, my home destroyed. I lived a very privileged life, albeit with what happened to my niece, a very privileged and very safe life growing up in Israel. That is not the experience of Palestinians. That has never been the experience of Palestinians, to live in their country in a way that is even remotely safe.
There's a military draft in Israel. So you joined a special operations unit and became a Red Beret. What was your experience during that time?
Well, I only went through the training, so that was only my first year. Then after that, I was injured, had knee surgery, and then I was removed and I did something else. But when you grow up in Israel as a young man, especially the kind of environment that I grew up in, then from about age 14, the military is what you talk about, is what you hear about. You have friends who have older siblings that have already been in, or it's really part of the conversation. At 16, you get your first call to be interviewed and so on. So it's very much a part of your life. And I grew up believing that, we had a right to, of course, have a state of our own. We had a right to have our own military, that we were a moral army, that we did the right thing, with maybe a few exceptions. But as a rule, we maintained the moral high ground. So I joined, and I was totally enthusiastic to join, become a military, a combat soldier, to give as much as I could. But the experience of, looking back and looking at all the things that I heard, these were years that nothing was much done. Plus, I'd only been in training the first year, so I really never did much. Maybe patrolling a little bit and things like that. I distinctly recall, being briefed by our lieutenant and being told, okay, you guys are going to be patrolling up and down the streets of Ramallah. And we were given batons and handcuffs, and we were a fully armed, commando unit. I'm thinking, why are they giving us handcuffs and batons? And the lieutenant said, if anybody so much as looks at you, you break every bone in their body. And I'm thinking, everybody's going to look at us. We're in the middle of a city full of, people, and we are an armed platoon. Everybody's going to look at us. Are we supposed to break everybody's arms? It absolutely made no sense to me. And gradually, I understood that our job was to maintain an occupation. Our job was to be the soldiers of the oppression. Our job had nothing to do with securing anybody, because there was really no threat. It was all about oppression. It was all about the occupation. It was all about showing the Palestinians who's boss, who's in charge.
Is that when you first started getting disillusioned with the Israeli army first?
It was that, and then right on the heels of that came Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And then the massacres in Sabra and Shatila.
This is 1982, 83.
1982, yeah, and 83. And so there was an entire generation of young Israelis who became disillusioned at that point. You know, and then Ariel Sharon was the defense minister, and Menachem Begin was prime minister, and they were lying right, left, and center about what the invasion of Lebanon was about and what was taking place and so on. So that was, in many ways, the beginning, yeah.
After your niece was killed, obviously it was a very painful time for you and your family. You said you wanted to do something, and so you found a meeting of Palestinians and Israelis in San Diego, where you lived at the time.
Right.
Describe that meeting.
Right. You know, it sounds so benign now. I started looking for people to talk to, and at some point, I can't remember how, but I heard that there were these living room dialogue groups, Jewish-Palestinian dialogue groups going on. So I looked them up, and finally I managed to get hold of a Palestinian who was hosting one of them. Very, very great guy. He's still a friend, George Horry. He's in the book. I talk about him in the book. And he invited me to a meeting that took place at his house in suburban San Diego. And I remember driving up, and by the time I got there, I was drenched in sweat. Going to a Palestinian home. What if they kidnap me? What if something happens? I'm in San Diego, which is really absurd.
And you had realized you didn't have any Arab friends?
I never met Palestinians. I grew up in Jerusalem, and I never met Palestinians because Jerusalem is completely segregated. Not only Jerusalem, the entire country is segregated. So even where the communities are very close geographically, there is no contact. The two are completely segregated. So this is the first time I'm sitting in a living room with people, and some of them are Palestinian, some of them are Jewish, and we're talking about things. It's a dialogue group. Everybody's talking about their experience. It's very jovial. It's very friendly. Most of the time, sometimes it gets pretty heated up. But that was my first experience, yes.
While you were in Israel, you decided to visit the West Bank. Were you afraid?
Oh, I was terrified. I was determined to meet, this was 2005, and the popular resistance movement just began. And these are marches that take place every Friday in a variety of towns and cities in the West Bank, protesting the occupation, protesting the theft of land and the building of settlements on Palestinian land, and eventually the wall, the building of the wall. And this began in a small village called Bilain, and that was where I went. A mutual friend said to me, "You got to go meet these guys." I called them. I had a rented car, and I drove to the West Bank. And it's fine as long as you're on the Israeli side, you're driving on highways. Once you go into the Palestinian side, the actual West Bank, then these are narrow streets, potholes. It's a different world. It's suddenly you're in the third world. It's a different world altogether, and Arabs everywhere. Arabs everywhere.
Obviously,
obviously. And as I'm driving, and I've driven these roads, and I drive them all the time now, but they're beautiful roads. With olive trees, and it's countryside, it's gorgeous. But all I thought was, this is going to be my last day on earth, because I am doing exactly what everyone always told me not to do. I'm alone. I'm easily identified as an Israeli. I'm in an Israeli car, and I'm in a rented car. I mean, I'm the perfect target. So it was interesting to go through that and experience these demons, this fear that I never thought I really had. And see them come out, and then overcome them, and then end up doing what I was going to do and meeting these Palestinians who've been friends of mine since then.
You talked to a new settler in the West Bank, a guy that was just moving into a brand new place.
Right.
What did you ask him? What did he tell you?
Well, I didn't do a lot of the talking. I went with these guys from Bilain, the Palestinians, on whose land this massive city of Modi'in Elite was built. It's a city for Orthodox Jews that was built on their land. And the wall wasn't really, hadn't been built yet. So we could walk right through from the village to the settlement. And they did all the talking, and they said, do you know whose land this is? And do you know that it was taken without being purchased? And do you know this and that and the other? And there was an interesting conversation. He had no idea. He was sure that he was doing the right thing. He was sure that he was on the right side of the issue. He was very optimistic. He was very friendly. He showed us a beautiful apartment, luxury apartment, right in the center of the country, very inexpensive. And the Palestinians were the ones asking all the questions and actually recording it as we were talking, which I thought was brilliant. I wanted to hear them. I was just there really. It was my first time in that kind of a situation, so I saw myself more as a spectator more than anything else.
Have you ever been to Gaza?
I have, yes.
What's it like?
Well, before I tell you what it's like, I have to tell you what it's like to get there, because I tried, as an Israeli, I'm not allowed to go through Israel, And because the Egyptian...
As an Israeli, you're not allowed into the Gaza Strip?
Israeli law prohibits Israelis from going into Palestinian territories.
Completely?
Completely. So I can't go into the West Bank either. It's prohibited. When I go, it's a felony. I break the law. Now, the West Bank is porous, so you could drive through. You drive. It's no big deal. It's not that hard. Gaza Strip is sealed. And if you go through a checkpoint, you go through this massive checkpoint, and they don't let you in. If you're an Israeli, that's it. So I can't do that because Israeli law prohibits it, so the Israelis won't let me through. Going through Egypt, I tried several times and failed because the Egyptians have closed the Gaza Strip in collaborating with Israel. Because the Egyptians, the Americans, and the Israelis are all signed on the siege, are all, maintaining the siege on Gaza. So at one point, somebody from Gaza sent me a message asking me if I would consider coming in through the subway.
Which is the tunnels?
Yeah. And I said yes.
From the Egypt side?
Yes. The tunnels are only from the Egypt side.
Okay. But there are tunnels going into Israel?
No, never have been.
Never?
Never. The tunnels are from there's the strip of land that the Gaza, the Gaza border with Egypt is very small. It's maybe 7 miles or something. It's very narrow. But because of the siege and because 2 million people live there without access to food, water, or medicine, or anything really, everything had to go through tunnels. So there were some tunnels that were created for pedestrians. There were over 1,000 tunnels at one point because that's the only way to bring in anything, food, money, you name it. So driving from Jerusalem to Gaza is maybe an hour and 20 minutes. I had to drive to Tel Aviv, which is an hour, fly to the very south, to the Sinai, then cross the border into the Sinai, which is Egypt, drive through the Sinai Peninsula to go to Rafah, which is the borders town between Gaza and Egypt, and then wait until I got the permit and then go through this tunnel. It took 14 hours. At the end of 14 hours, I looked at my watch and I was exactly an hour and 20 minutes from my house in Jerusalem, which was absurd. Now, it's a very crowded place, 2 million people living with no access to the world. It's other than, a little internet and stuff like that. People are very creative, people are working hard, people are driving, they're going to school, education levels are very high, universities are bustling. There's a great desire to achieve and to live and to be successful just like anywhere else, maybe even more so. A lot of creativity, a lot of young writers, a lot of young, very creative people, in many ways. That's what Gaza is like, but it's very sad.
But it's also very Islamist. In other words, they do glorify the what they call the martyrs, right? The suicide bombers. They put their posters up on the walls. They teach their kids to hate Israelis, to hate Jews, I should say. They teach them vile things like Jews are descendants of pigs and apes. Sorry to even say that.
The premise of any of what you just said.
You don't think that that's true?
I know that none of it is true. I know that none of what you said just now.
The Mickey Mouse and the killing a Jew.
None of it is true. Now, Gaza is a very diverse.
Tape.
Gaza, many things are on tape. Gaza is a very diverse place. Some people are very religious, some people are very not religious, some people are somewhere in between. So there are 2 million people there, and it's not monolith.
Sure. I mean, I'm not saying everybody's a terrorist, but they do have sympathy for...
Hold on. All Palestinian towns, all Palestinian refugee camps, all Palestinian villages glorify the martyrs, whether they died as in suicide missions, whether they died in other ways, whether they're prisoner, So they glorify their fighters because they see them as their fighters. Now, Palestinians don't need to be taught to hate Jews. Jews came, took their land, kicked out 1 million people, committed numerous massacres, and for the last 7 decades, particularly in Gaza, every few years come in and commit enormous massacres. The last one was 2014, where they murdered 2,500 people, and they were the lucky ones. The ones that remained injured without care are probably doing worse. So if I was a Palestinian, there's no question in my mind I would hate Jews. Now here when we hear that the problem is the Jews, of course everybody goes, oh, it's racist. But Israel declares itself to be the Jewish state. The IDF declares itself to be the Jewish army. They are Jews who drop the bombs. Jewish millionaires and billionaires give Israel tons of money, billions of dollars, besides the foreign aid that comes to Israel from the U.S. So, and they are Jews. Israel is Jews, you know.
Miko, I want to ask you one last question. The very little time we have left. You used to believe, like your father did, in a two-state solution. Now you believe in a one-state solution. What does that mean?
Well, Israel established a single state over all of Palestine. There is one state. That's what happened. That's it. It's done. There's no way to reverse that. There is no place in the entire country that you can slice out and say, well, we'll have a Jewish state here, Palestinian state there. Israel destroyed that possibility on purpose, by design, by populating what used to be the West Bank. Now it's just Judea and Samaria. There really isn't the West Bank. So the reality is that there is a single state. It's a racist state. It's a state that offers privileges to Jews at the expense of others, expense of Palestinians. So if we are looking for a just solution to the question of Palestine, we have to decide, do we believe in a Jewish state that is a racist state, or do we believe in democracy and equal rights, in which case we need to have a single state that is a democratic state? Those are the two options. I believe in the latter.
Do you think that it could be a democratic state? Do you think that it could be a secular state?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question in my mind. I think it will be. I have absolutely no question in my mind that that's
so
exactly
bring down
what it's going
all
to be.
the walls, all the barriers,
Yes.
and everybody lives together in peace.
Yes, absolutely.
Miko, thanks so much for being
Sure.
on the program.
Thank you.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.